And so this video should be available, early next week or something like that. Maybe even later today, but probably not. So again, my name is David Fass. I'm the trainer at InetSoft, and we've been doing these webinars for seemingly forever. But this is the last webinar of this year. And I don't yet have a topic set up for next year. We do plan to keep doing these, perhaps not monthly, perhaps a little bit less frequently, but since we've covered over the past 2 years, we've covered a lot of the basic topics, but we do plan to keep on doing it. If any of you have ideas for topics that you'd like to see me cover next year, whatever they might be, it doesn't have to be basic, could be, some more advanced topics, more application oriented, more data oriented, whatever, if there's something you'd like to see me do as part of the webinar that you feel could be, captured in the amount of time that we have for these, which is, somewhere between a half hour and an hour, please send me an email. My email is david.fass, F-A-S-S, at inetsoft.com. I'll definitely be very happy to get any suggestions. I have a little list that I've assembled myself, but I would definitely like to get some ideas from customers as well. Okay, so today's topic, last of the year, is connecting to a data source and creating a query. In a way, this is kind of a really basic topic, but since this is, many of the topics that we've done in these webinars are oriented towards, more towards users, things that, creating a dashboard, even creating a data worksheet. These are, things that users might typically do. Only recently we've started covering some topics that are more towards the administration side, and this is one of those topics. Setting up a data source, creating a query is not something that a user would do. It would, it would be something that either an administrator or a developer, somebody who's familiar with the database, it's kind of a task that sort of person would do. So, so even though it is a kind of fundamental topic, we haven't covered it yet. So let's get into it now. Okay, so connecting to a data source, the most common sort of data source that you would connect to is a relational database data source. That's probably 90%, maybe more, of data sources that people would be connecting to, because most people have their data in relational databases, among which would be included Oracle and SQL Server and MySQL, DB2, and about 100 other possible relational databases that are all out there. Some of them very popular, some of them less popular. So let's take a look at how you would connect to a relational database, and then how we would go ahead and create a query that would return data from that database. And then we'll go a little bit beyond that. We'll also look at setting up a connection to a text file or an Excel file. And then, time permitting, we'll take a quick look at creating a data model based on a relational database data source. So that's the plan. I don't think it should take too long. And of course, feel free to ask questions and type a question in the question box. I have somewhere here Style Studio. So like I said, this is a kind of task that a developer or an administrator would do. You need Style Studio to create a connection to a database. So the first thing that you'd want to do when you're connecting to a relational database, like any of the ones that I just mentioned, and these are all considered JDBC data sources. Basically, a JDBC data source is any database that provides a Java driver. It's basically a file or a set of files that allows a Java program to connect to the database. All of the big databases are, including the ones that I mentioned, are JDBC databases. So Oracle, SQL Server, that whole list. Those are all JDBC data sources because they all provide Java drivers that allow a program like Style Studio or the InetSoft server to connect to the database. So the first thing, when you're setting up a connection to a database, the first thing is you need to think about getting that file, the Java driver file. It's usually a jar file or maybe more than one jar file. And then you have to do two things with that file. So this is even before you get started setting up the connection in Style Studio. This is just kind of housekeeping, because without that file, without the JDBC driver, anything else you do here is not going to work, right? You need that file to facilitate the connection between the database and our software. So what you need to do is you need to put that, you need to basically do two things with that file. First of all, you need to put it in a location where it can be accessed by the server, right? Because the server will need to access that file in order to connect to the database. And so this has changed in version 12.2. Formerly, let's see if I can, for those of you who are on earlier versions, I'll try to demonstrate both things here. Formerly, that file, the any database driver file, would be placed in a location such as, let me find 12.1 install here. It's this one. Do I have this one? It's empty. Let me see if I have a working... yeah, I might just show you for 12.2. I'm not even sure that I have 12.1 installed right now. In spite of the fact that it looks like I have 1,000 of them. I'm not sure which one. Let me check which... sorry, it just occurred to me that I should show you both both places, because some of you might be on, or probably on 12.1, 414. Let me see if I can find 414 here. I see 430. No. No, it's also missing. Give me one more second and see if I can find it. Okay, so this is I'm looking at the a 12.1 installation of Style Intelligence, and in there, if you were working with 12.1 and for that matter for earlier versions, in the server tree, which would be Tomcat, Web Apps, SREE, Web-INF. This location, which I've called the server tree, is basically this particular location. In the classes folder, that's what we call SREE home in version 12.1 and previous versions. And this was basically, kind of a special directory that the server uses. It's where all, the server reads and writes important files from this location, webapps/SREE/web-INF/classes. If you go up one level from there, there's a lib folder, right? And so this location, again, web apps, SREE, web-INF lib, in versions 12.1 or earlier, is where you would put your database driver files. So if you have, let's say, a SQL Server database, right, there would be some jar file that you could download from, from Microsoft's website, or, would come with the package or something, and you would put that jar file, might be one jar file, might be more than one jar file. You would put that JDBC driver in this location, and then when the server starts up, the InetSoft server starts up, it'll look in that location, it'll find the driver, and it will be able to connect to that database. All right, so that's in versions 12.1 and earlier. In version 12.2, we changed things up a little bit, and here I've got another listing. In version 12.2, there's a folder. Let me. Right, this is in the Windows program data. Right, so go to your C drive, you'll see there's program files, and there's program data. In program data, and this location, the location that I'm describing here will varies depending on you're using Windows or Mac or Linux, right? So you can check the installation manual to find out where this is on those other platforms. For Windows, it's here, program data, InetSoft. In this location, there's a folder called shared libs. Right, and so for version 12.2 and later, where you would put that JDBC driver would be in here, in the shared libs folder. Right, so you see there's a bunch of jar files in there already, and just like I mentioned earlier, if you have a SQL Server and you get the jar file, you would drop it into this location. Okay, so it's a change from version 12.1 and earlier to version 12.2. So make a note of that if you're migrating to 12.2, that there are going to be some changes like that. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that your development tool, Style Studio, can also connect to the database, which means that Style Studio also needs to have access to that JDBC driver file. So what you would do in Style Studio is you would go to the File menu, go to Configure, and go to Class Path. And I have version 12.2 here, Style Studio, and you can see that in version 12.2, that directory, InetSoft /shared libs, is already on the class path, right? All the contents of that directory, there's a backslash asterisk there. That means that all the contents of that shared libs directory are on the Style Studio class path by default, and so that means that any JDBC driver file that you drop in there is going to be on the Style Studio class path. So for 12.2 and hopefully later, basically you shouldn't need to do anything here to make Style Studio access that JDBC driver. You should be good to go as long as you put it in that location in the shared libs directory. However, for version 12.1 and earlier, what you'll need to do is you'll need to add the jar files, right? So there's an add jar file button here, and what you would do is you press the add jar file button. It will pop up a file system browser eventually. It's thinking about, I guess it's scanning something. I'll just wait a moment. Anyway, I'll just keep talking. So while we're waiting for that to pop up, so basically there it is. You get a file system browser, and what you would need to do is you would need to browse to the location where you put that jar file, right? So wherever those are. In this case, they're in that shared libs directory. So I would go to I would need to find that location. So program data, InetSoft. Whoops, that's something else. Right, shared libs, right, and then you would select the JDBC driver file from here, press open. I don't need to do that, but then it would be listed, that jar file would be listed over here in the class path, and you would do that for any jar files that represent the JDBC driver for that database. Okay, so anyway, that's just kind of the housekeeping that is required before you can get any connection to work. You need to have that JDBC driver in the right place and on the class path for Style Studio. Okay, then what you do is you go ahead and once you've got the driver in place, you go ahead and create the connection to the database. So, and that's fairly simple. For a JDBC database, what you do is you press the new button in Style Studio, select data source. Right, we've done some stuff in Style Studio before. You can create reports here, you can create table styles, a bunch of other stuff, but you can also set up a data source. So you click on data source, then you've got a bunch of different data source types here. The list that you see here will depend to some extent on what driver files you have installed. So for example, you can see that I've got a couple of odd database types listed here, Cassandra and MongoDB, right? That's because I have some special drivers in a special location, so those show up there. But generally, you'd see just the first 6 of these or so. If you want to create a connection to a JDBC database, you obviously select that option. It's the top option. Press OK, and then you get this little wizard here that kind of guides you through the procedure. You can give it a name. So in this case, I'll just create another connection to our sample database, which is a Derby database, and so I'll call it sample connection. All right, this is just the name under which the connection will be listed here in the asset panel under data source, right? So it's completely arbitrary. There are probably some limitations on characters that you can use in there, but anyway, that should be fine. Sample connection, press next. All right, and then you select the type of JDBC database that you're connecting to, and you see you've got a lengthy list here. Our sample database is a Derby embedded database, so I would select Derby embedded, right? If you have SQL Server, you would try to find that, so like SQL Server. And you can see that basically what it's doing is it's automatically populating the driver class, right? So that's kind of internal to the driver, and it's just doing that based on we know based on what you select what the correct driver class is. If for some reason that's not right, there is an option way down at the bottom here. You can select other, right, and that allows you to manually enter the driver class. So if you have you know, a database that's not one of the ones listed, but you know the driver class, you can just enter it manually. In this case, again, I'll use Derby embedded, so that's done, and then press next, and then there's just some basic information for connecting to the database. The main thing is the JDBC URL. So in this case, it's very simple. It's just class path : orders. In general, what you need to do if you're setting this up, if you're a developer and you're trying to get a connection to a database that's running somewhere, is you need to ask the your database administrator what URL you need to use. That would be, so rather than doing trial and error to try to get the correct URL, which will vary by database type, right? So the SQL Server URL is different than an Oracle URL, which is different than a DB2 URL. So just ask the DBA, what URL to use, and they'll tell you what to put in there. So for our sample database, this is correct: JDBC : Derby : class path : orders. If there's login information required, you can add it. Otherwise, you can disable that. If there's a default schema, you can enter that here. Again, none of that is needed for our sample database, so I'll just press the test button. Comes back with test is successful, so that's good. If the test does not come back successful, right? So if you get a cannot connect to database error message or something of that nature, then the two first things that you'll check are whether the JDBC URL is correct, right? So again, you check that with your database administrator, and they might test it using some other tool. There are other tools that can connect to a database, so they might verify the URL that you're using with some other tool, make sure that the URL is correct. The other possibility is that, of course, login information could be wrong, but the other more common possibility is that the driver file, the JDBC driver, is not on the Style Studio class path, right? So sometimes people forget to do that, right? And if you don't have that JDBC driver, just what I talked about for the previous 5 minutes, if that's not available to Style Studio because it's not on the class path, then none of this will work, right? So that's the other common thing that you'll need to check, right? So in this case, we should be good to go. I press finish, right? You can see that if I go ahead and save this, right? So it opens a new tab, sample connection. Basically, it's all the settings here are all the settings that I just made, the URL, the driver, and so on. Some other stuff down here that I'll mention in just a second. If I press the save button, right, then that gets saved over here into this asset panel as under the name that I gave it, sample connection, right? So this is a new connection to a JDBC database. Happens to be the same database that we already have a connection to. There's already the sample orders database, which is a connection to the same database, but now I've got another connection to it. But if you were connecting to an Oracle database or SQL Server or DB2 or MySQL, any of those, the procedure would be exactly the same. The only difference would be the structure of the URL, which again you have to get from your database administrator. And so basically that's it. There are a few other options you can set here. Again, these are things that generally the database expert would tell you what you need to do here if to set a default schema, or if it needs ANSI join syntax when it's constructing queries, or if there's a particular transaction isolation level that's needed, if the tables in the database need to be referenced in a particular way, fully qualified or partially qualified, right? Those are not things that I could tell you. Those are things that your database administrator could tell you. Down here at the bottom, there's an option to, and I'm not going to go into it, but there's an option to set up multiple connections. And I don't know if I've discussed this before in these webinars, but basically the context for this option, for this feature over here, is where you have a multi-tenant environment. So if you have, the situation would be, let's say you've got, you're running a restaurant business and you've got multiple franchises, and basically each of those franchises, the managers are logging in. They want to get a connection to the database, but you've got separate schemas set up for each of those franchises. So when but those schemas have basically the same structure. So let's say you've got a franchise in North Jersey, and you've got a franchise in South Jersey, and so in your database you've got a schema for the North Jersey franchise, you've got a schema for the South Jersey franchise, and what you might want to do is set up different connections to those different schemas. So when the person logs in from the North Jersey franchise, they get connected to the North Jersey schema, and when the person logs in from the South Jersey franchise, they get connected to the South Jersey schema. And and then basically what you can do is you can set up essentially a data model for each of those, for each of those different connections. I'm not going to go into those details. I just want to, give you a clue as to what this is down here. And you can look in the documentation if you want, much more detail on it. So that's basically it. That's setting up a connection to a JDBC database. And the next step from here would be to create either a query or to create a data model. Or, for that matter, a data worksheet. So you can do any of those three things. So let me just quickly show you creating a query and creating a data worksheet based on this this connection that we just set up. And then I'm going to come back and show you an alternative type of connection to a text file or Excel file. Okay, so from this point, now you've got your connection to the to your database. Now you might wonder, where is this information actually stored? And that again has changed from version 12.1 and earlier to version 12.2, a lot of changes. So in version 12.1 and earlier, do I still have that directory up somewhere? Let's see if I can find it. Wasn't that? Oh, it was here. Okay, so in version 12.1 and earlier, there was a file in the SREE home directory, which was the SREE webinf classes. That was what we called the home directory or the server repository. There was a file in there. Let's see if I can find it. You know what? I don't even see it there. I wonder if it was changed even before that. Unless I'm just overlooking it. There was a file called datasource.xml, but I don't see it, so I wonder if maybe that was even converted over before that. Or I'm just looking past it. But I don't see it here. Okay. So there was, at least at one point, there was a file called datasource.xml, and that's where the connection information would be saved. In other words, just this connection information that you see here, not the data from the database, just the connection information. In 12.2, and it appears maybe even in 12.1 and later, although I don't think, I think that change was made for 12.2. But if you take a look at 12.2 directory structure, let me find that one. That's not it. Okay, in 12.2 and later, the SREE home directory is in this location, right? So it's in the program data, at least for Windows program data, InetSoft server config, right? And in there, there's an asset.dat.d folder, and this is now where a lot of different information is saved, including data source information. So when you set up and define a new data source like we've just done, that information is saved in this location, asset.dat.d. And if you look in there, it's a little bit cryptic what's in there, so it might not be exactly clear where that information is, but it's somewhere in there. Okay. Okay, so what's the next step here? The next step is to define a query. You've got your connection to the database. So what you do is you then find your connection, and you can right-click on there and select New Query. All right, and again, you get a little wizard here that will guide you through the steps of setting up a query. Any of this stuff that you do in the wizard can be changed later on, so I'll just call it My Query, and press Next. The next thing it asks you to do is find the tables from which you want the query to pull data. In this very simple example, we'll use just contacts and customers, 2 tables. Right? You can double-click on them or press the arrow button here to add them into the tables list. So contacts and customers, I want data from those 2 tables in the database. Press Next. Right? The next panel allows you to specify links between the tables. These are joins. It tries to make a guess at the joins that you might want, so you can see that there already is a join between these 2 tables. In the event that that was not there, so if I delete that join, then what you would do is you would just drag to create the join. So if my join column, the field that relates these two tables is the customer ID, right? I see customer ID here, customer ID there. I just click on the field here, drag to the field there. That creates an inner join. You can see the equal symbol. That means that this is an equijoin or an inner join. If you want to change the join type, what you would do is you would right-click on the join, select options, and then that lets you specify additional join types. Right. So for this example, we'll just keep it as the inner join, press the next button, right? So now the two tables are related. When you're defining a query, you should, in general, make sure that all the tables are related. So whatever tables you've selected, they should all be joined to one another for purposes of the query. Right? They should all be related to one another. So then you press next. Here you select the fields that you want to return in the query. So the query is going to return a particular set of columns, right? This is where you specify that list of columns. And so for this example, what I might do is I might just select all of the non-ID columns, right? So I press the Add All button. That's the big arrow here. And then I'm just going to remove the ID fields by double-clicking them, and they get sent back over here. Right? So now I've got a list of all the columns from these two tables that are not ID fields. Right, so that's there. Then if you press the next button, it takes you to conditions. This lets you set a condition, a filtering condition on the query, right? In this case, I'll just skip that step. Maybe I'll come back to it in a moment. There's a sort option. This allows you to specify a sort. So for example, if you wanted to sort the result by the first name, contact first name, you would click first name, and then there's a button here. It's the rightmost button that says order, and if you press that button, you'll notice that there's a little arrow next to the name of the field, and that arrow can either point down or up. Right? So if you click it this way, it points up. You click it again, it points down. That's the sort order. So if I want to sort, for example, descending by first name, I would have the downward pointed arrow there. Then I would proceed. There's a grouping tab here. I can specify grouping, and I'll come back and I'll show you how that works in a moment. But you can specify group fields. If you do that, though, in general, if you specify grouping fields, you should also specify some aggregation. And to do that, you have to go back to the Fields tab. So I'll try to illustrate that in a moment. And then the last thing here is SQL string, right? So if you click on that, it shows you the SQL that has been constructed by what you've done in the wizard up to this point, right? So this is the actual statement that will be sent to the database, right? It's in the language that the database understands, SQL, and it, for a query as simple as this, it's pretty easy to understand. It says select this set of fields from these two tables where the two tables are related by this equality condition, and then order the result by first name in descending order. Right? So that's what we're instructing the database to do. Now, queries obviously get a lot more complicated than this, and in some cases you may actually not want to use the wizard, right? You might have your query already written in some other tool, or your database administrator might have a set of queries that they cooked up that are fairly complex, and maybe you're not sure exactly how you would construct them using the tabs in the wizard. You can just copy and paste your query into here, right? Right, so this is, you can edit what you see here, and you can also just copy and paste. And so that's fine. If your queries are very complex, or if they use, some kind of proprietary syntax for the database, then what you might want to do is turn off the parse SQL option here, because the parse SQL option will cause the Style Studio to try to, to parse the query and to try to kind of reverse engineer the settings under these tabs, right? It'll try to read the query and then decide, what it needs to do under each of these tabs to make it synced up with the query that you've entered. If the query is very complex or uses special syntax, it won't be able to do that, and it'll just hang there for a while and do nothing good. So if that's the case, then just turn off that option. So once you're done with that, and you got the query that you want, you press finish. Right, and the wizard goes away, and then it opens up the query in a tab here in Style Studio, and all of the settings that you had made, you still have access to. Right down here at the bottom, you've got the main query tab, right? And if you select that, you can see that you still have access to the links tab over here. If you want to add new tables in, you can drag new tables into the query. You've got fields, right? Again, you can make any changes there. conditions, sort, grouping, right? And then the only new thing that you have here, again, you have SQL string, the SQL string tab down at the bottom. The only new thing that you have here is now a preview tab, and if you press that, it'll execute the query and give you some sample data back. And if you take a look, it should be sorted in reverse order by first name because we put that sort on that column, right? Sort by first name, so it starts with William and then goes, up to or down to Adam. So that's the basics of creating a query on a JDBC data source. So nothing very complicated about it. Let's just take a look at just a couple of other twists here. So if you save that query, press Save button, and then you go back here into the Asset panel, then you should find that under that data source, you now have this query listed called My Query, and at any later time, if you want to open it, you can double-click on it and so on. So anyway, we still have it open here. So let me just show you a couple things. As far as filtering, right, so let's say we wanted to filter this to show data, let's say, just from New Jersey, right? So I can see that I've got a few records here from New Jersey. So if I wanted to filter it, I would just go back to the main query. Well, I could do this two ways. I could either go to SQL string, and if I know SQL fairly well, I could just modify the SQL string to, to enter that filtering condition. Unfortunately, my SQL, personally, my own SQL is pretty bad, pretty rusty. So so I don't 100% trust myself to do that. So what I would do is I would go to main query, go to conditions up here, and I would enter the condition over here, and I would say something like, let's see if I can find the state, right? Customer state is equal to, and there's a button here, a browse button. You can click that, and it'll show you the list of values that are in that that particular field. All right, and I'll select NJ, press append. All right, so that gives me this simple condition: customer state is equal to NJ. And then if I go ahead and I preview this again, right? So now when the SQL query executes, it gives me back just the records from the state of New Jersey. Okay, now let's look at one last thing with regard to the query, and that is grouping, grouping and aggregation. And the way this works, let me get rid of the that query. Sorry, not the query. Get rid of the condition. Just delete all condition. And the way that grouping works is you go to the grouping tab and you select the grouping field. So let's say that I wanted to group this on customer state. Right. So basically, I want to just list the individual states. So I would select a grouping field, and then what I would need to do is under the Fields tab here, see, it's giving me an error. It says columns in selection not found in group by. What that means is that now I have columns listed here that are not grouping columns, and that's a problem because when you do grouping at the query level, basically you only are going to return the grouped information. So what it seems like I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to return grouped information. For example, the state is I defined as a grouping field, as well as detail information. For example, I'm not grouping by first name or last name or any of those other ones. So it's not going to let me do that, right? So when you do grouping at the query level, basically you're only going to get the grouped information. So I'm going to remove, well, here's how I have to do it. First I have to remove this field, then I have to go here and remove all the fields except for the one that I want to group. You could have more than one grouping field, by the way, but here I'm just doing one grouping field. All right, so now I've just got the one grouping field I want. Now I can go over here and select that as a grouping field. All right, so I've specified that I want to group by state, and in my fields list, I'm only selecting a grouping field, right? Because again, I can only, if I'm doing grouping, I can only request fields that are grouped. I can't have a mixture of grouped and ungrouped fields. But I can add here some summary field, right? So let's say that I wanted, for each state, I wanted to sum up the, let's see what might make sense here. Let's say I wanted to sum up the number of customers in that state. So I might want to do like sum of customer ID. So what I would do is I would create an expression, right? There's a FX button over here. Press it's called add expression. Press that button. And then I would, you can use the little list of functions here. So I would, add sum, and in there I would add customer ID. All right, and so I create this little expression. It's a little bit, it's a little bit of a roundabout way to do it, but basically what I'm saying is that for each customer state group in this case, I want to sum up the customer IDs. Actually, probably make more sense to count the customer IDs than to sum them. So you can add Right. So I want to count up for each state, count up the customer IDs. Right. Press OK. Right. So now I've got this grouping field and an expression field that where basically I'm aggregating the customer IDs for each state. Right. And if I had other grouping fields, then it would give me the breakdown for those other for whatever grouping structure I have. Right. So that's basically how you do grouping and summarization in a I should have given that a better alias probably. Let me go back. All right, so if I click on that, you can see that alias here, it says exp_1. So what I might want to do is something like a count of customers. And give it that better alias. Column type, I guess, could be integer or something. Okay, so then if I go to take a look at the SQL string, you can see that the SQL string has changed to match the settings that I did in under the other tab. Right, so now it says give me the state, give me the count of customer ID under this alias from those two tables, where the join condition is still in effect, and it says group by state and still order by. I still have that order by condition. I should probably could probably just delete that over here. All right, so I've modified that SQL, and then I can press preview, and it gives me an error. Let's see what the problem is. Doesn't think it's a valid aggregation. Let's see why. I don't see the problem. I wonder if the database doesn't like the count operator. Oh, so that works. So something about the count operator. I'm not going to go into it, but anyway, so basically this is the result that I get. So I've got it grouped by state, right? And for each state, it's that's just the alias count of customers. But it appears that it's now it's summing up the. So there was something had choked on the count operator, it seems. But anyway, you get the idea. This is how, when you do grouping and aggregation in a query, that's how you go about it, and you can only get the grouped information, right? You only get information on the group level. Now, that's obviously some limitation of doing this at the query level, which is why if you're creating queries, you might choose to do the grouping instead, either in a data worksheet, or you might choose to do it in the report. If you're designing a report, and for example a table in a report, you can have both the grouped and the detail information in the same table. So that's obviously gives you a lot more flexibility. But if you're doing your grouping and aggregation at the query level, then basically you can choose to have the detail information, or you can choose to have the grouped information, but not both at the same time in the same query. Okay, so that's a quick demonstration of creating a query on a data source that you create. So I'm going to save that query. Now I said that another route that you could take here is to create a data worksheet, right? So you've got your connection to the database set up. One route that you could take is to create queries based on that. Another route that you could take is to create a data worksheet based on that. So let me illustrate how you would create a data worksheet. And we've done this a number of times before, so there won't be anything new here. But what you do is you could do this in Style Studio, or you could do this in Visual Composer through the server. But you press the New button, select Worksheet. All right, so that creates a new data worksheet, and I know we've done data worksheets in some past webinars, so nothing really that new about this. And then what you would do is you would find your data source. Right, so here's the sample connection data source that we made about 20 minutes ago, and you can see that there's the query that we created, that's there, but also the tables are there. Right, so by default, when you're designing a data worksheet, you have access to the database tables. If you're doing that through Visual Composer, the access to the database tables is controlled by administration settings. So, if you're a run-of-the-mill user, you might not have access to the database tables, but if the administrator sets it up if the administrator gives you permission to access the database tables, then you would, even if you were doing this through Visual Composer through the browser, you would also see those database tables there. And then you can, do whatever you want with the database tables, right? So that, if you want to forego that query wizard and just use the data worksheet, you could do, basically the same thing that we just did, except in the data worksheet, you could have customers, right? You can bring in the customers table. You could bring in the I forgot what the two tables were. The contacts table was the other one, maybe, right? And you can join them together, right? So there's the customer ID field there, customer ID field here. We can join, right? We can join those two tables together. That's basically the same thing that was done in the query, right? The two tables are joined together. Then you get this big, this big table with, with the results, and so on, right? So you basically, at this point, you're in the data worksheet world. You can do any of the things that you could do in a data worksheet. If you want to, if you want to do live preview, you could do that, and so on and so forth, right? So that's another route that you could take, right? So route number one, after you've created your data source connection, is you can create a query using the query wizard. Route number two is you can use the data worksheet to do whatever mashup you want to do using the tables in that data source. And then the third route, which I'll talk about in just a moment, is that you can go ahead and create a data model. Before I talk about that, let me just take a look at creating another kind of data source, right? So the one that we've looked at so far is creating a JDBC data source, a connection to a JDBC database. Another common thing that might account for the other if JDBC databases are 90% of the database connections, and the another 9% or so might be text or Excel connections. And so also fairly simple. So I'm going to connect to a sample. I think it's a CSV file, or maybe it's an Excel file. It's pretty much the same regardless. So I'll just show you that very quickly. So again, I'll press the new button, select data source. In this case, I want to connect to a text or Excel file, so that's the option that I'll select there, text Excel, press OK. I get a different kind of wizard, slightly different. I'll give it a name. I'll call it performance data, right, because that's the data that I'm going to connect to. Press Next. Here it gives me an option of selecting file or URL. In many cases, URL may be a better option, because remember that the file path, right? If you're doing an absolute path here, that's going to have to work not only for Style Studio, but it's also going to have to work on the server, because the server is also going to be accessing that data file. So that that might introduce a little bit of complexity, right? Because the file path that you have to enter here for Style Studio to access the file might be a different path than the server would access, unless the file is like on a network drive or something like that. So in some cases URL would be handier, but just for demonstration purposes, I'll just use the file path, and I'll just use an absolute path. And I know that I have a file here somewhere that I can use for this. Have a file called performance data, right? So this is an Excel file that has some old performance data for our software. So you select the file, and again, this specifying it this way could be a little bit problematical, because once I move from the Style Studio environment to the server environment, does the server have access to that path? Probably not. That's that's a location on my particular computer, so that's that's just something that you'd need to pay attention to when you're using file paths. And I press Next here, and it asks me, it takes me to an import tab, first row header. I say yes, press Finish. All right, and then that opens up the data source, which again is just the connection information, right? Everything here, it's not the data itself, just the information to connect to that Excel file. And there's a bunch of different settings. You can see it's different than the JDBC connection information, obviously, because there's some stuff that you have to specify that's, that's unique to an Excel file that JDBC connection wouldn't have, for example, start row and end row and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into all the details, but that's basically the procedure. In some cases, you can modify the format and the type down here. In other cases, not. It might depend on whether it's an Excel file or a CSV file or a text file. Right? You can select the type of the file over here. If if it's an Excel file, you can choose the sheet. And again, the start row, end row, start column, end column, and so on. So if you go ahead and save that, you can press the test data source button. up here. It says test is successful. That means that it can connect to that file, and then you can go ahead and save it, and then that connection information is saved as a new data source here in the data source listing called performance data. And just like we did for the JDBC connection, once you've got that data source in place, you can go ahead and create a query, right? So if I right-click on that Excel data source, right, there's an option here, new query, right? So I press new query, and then, I can just call it my query. The wizard, again, differs somewhat for the different data source types. So for a JDBC query, you had certain options such as grouping and sorting and so on. You don't have those for the Excel query. You have some, possibly some other stuff, but, you've got duplicate. Oh, I called the other one my query. Great. So this one I'll call my Excel query. Press next. All right, so these are the columns that are in that Excel file, so I can select all of them. If I want to, I can set a condition, and then press finish. All right, that gives me this new query. I can save the query. All right, so now if I go under performance data under the Excel data source, I can see that there's an Excel query and a query on that Excel data source there. And then again, if I need to make a change to the condition, to the fields, I can make those changes here, and down at the bottom I've got a preview, and it runs the query on the Excel file and pulls back the information from that file. Right. So what I've shown you here is just kind of the two most basic types of data source connections that you'd make, either to a JDBC data source or to an Excel or text data source. Okay, so now having shown you that, let me show you one other thing in the remaining time, and then I'll take any questions. And the last thing that I want to show you is that third avenue that you could take when you have a JDBC connection, right? So you've got a JDBC data source like the one that we made here, sample connection. I showed you the first avenue that you could use to get your data is to create a query, like this one here, my query. Second avenue that you could use to get your data out of that data source is to create a data worksheet, which has the advantage of giving you a much more flexible tool. A data worksheet is much easier to do, to do mashup, to do grouping, aggregation, filtering. All that stuff is easier in a data worksheet. And the third avenue that you could take is to create a data model. Right? A data model is different than a data worksheet and a query because both the data worksheet and a query are basically pulling back kind of focused. It's a set of columns that you want to see. It's a restricted set of columns that serve a particular purpose. A data model is more like an all-encompassing view of the database schema. So basically a data model gives you access to more or less everything in the database. So it's kind of a conceptually quite different. And I'm just going to show you the very basics of setting up a data model. And then I will stop talking. So to create a data model, what you do is you right-click on the data model node under the connection, right? And you'll only find that under JDBC connections, right? So you don't have that for an Excel file. You don't have that for other data sources. This is only something for a JDBC connection to a relational database. And so what you have to do to create a data model is two things. First of all, you have to create a physical view, and second of all, you have to create a logical model. A physical view, as we'll see in just a second, is just a set of tables and joins. You're basically setting up the join structure. So I'll select physical view. I'll give it a name. I'll call it sample view. And then what you have to do here is you basically have to select the tables that you want the data model to have access to. So in this case, I'm going to select all of the tables. These are the tables in the database. You can see it's a very small database, our sample database. Select all the tables and drag them in. Right, so now I've got all these 10 tables in the physical view, and I'm going to specify the joins between these tables. Now I could do that just by clicking and dragging. So for example, here's a categories table, and somewhere here I've got a products table. Orders, that's not it. Products, right? So here's the products table. I know that these two tables are related to one another, and they're related on the category ID field. I see that field in both tables. Just like we did when we were doing the query, I could click and drag to relate those two tables, create a join, right? Looks a little bit different than with the query, but there's a join, and I can right-click on the join, select properties. That allows me to specify the characteristics of the join and so on. Now that would get tedious if you had a few dozen tables, a few hundred tables to have to do that individually for every table. Instead, what you could do is you could use the automatic join feature, which is this one over here. It's called auto join. You press that button. It lets you do the join either by key relation or by column name. So here I'll specify by key relation. All right, add all those key columns over here, press finish, and that automatically joins up all the tables that I've selected. Now, obviously, if you were doing this for real, you would need to, probably double check those joins and make sure that those joins are the joins that you actually want, because, you can only rely on automation so far. You're if you're setting up the data model, you're the expert as to how these tables need to be related, so you don't want to rely on our, the intelligence of our tool to have done that correctly. You'd want to double check that these are related in the way that you expect them to be related. Of course, it's hard to see that because it's all kind of a big jumble of spaghetti over here. But what you could do is there's a button here that kind of sorts it out called Auto Layout. So if you press that button, it'll apply some algorithm to reduce the number of line crossings and so on, give you a little bit better view of what you've done. Okay, so this is what a physical view is. It's just a set of tables and the joins between the tables. It's not a particular query, right? It's not saying that, give me all the data from these tables. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm just laying out the relationships of these tables so that at a later point, somebody could request data from these tables, and it would be, and the relationship of those tables would already have been specified. Right. Now, one problem that I'm not going to go into here, but something that you have to deal with in physical views is the concept of a join cycle, which is what's highlighted in red here. A join cycle is basically where you have an ambiguity in the join path. It means that because when a query is being generated, it's going to be generated automatically based on the joins that you specify here. So you can't have any ambiguities in the join path because that it's going to have to pick one join path or another, and it doesn't know how to do that. So what I'm going to do here is just use one of the couple of techniques that's available for breaking a join path, and I'll just do that by, let's see what would make the most sense here. I'm just going to alias this table here really quick. And I know I'm not explaining this at all, but because we're out of time, but and I just want to show you the basics of what a data model is. So I'm going to do this. So basically what I've done is I've just created a copy of this regions table, and I'm going to use that copy to break the join cycle, right? So that eliminates the ambiguity because now I've introduced this new table. That then highlights another join cycle up here that I have to take care of, and this one I'm going to break using a different technique called a weak join. I'll just do that. So now I've broken those join cycles, and my point here is not to show you how to do it. My point was just to show you that that's something that comes up when you're creating a physical view and something you need to deal with. So this again is a physical view. It's a set of tables and a set of joins, and that's done. Right. The next part of the data model and the part that is exposed to the user, right? This part the user will never see, right? So somebody creating a dashboard, creating a data worksheet based on the data model, or somebody creating a report based on a data model never sees the physical view. This is totally in the background. But what they do see is the logical model. And basically the logical model is where you take the fields from the physical view and you decide how you want to expose those fields to users. And so I'll just show you a very quick example of doing that. So I'm going to go back to back over here to the asset panel, right? So there's a sample view is the physical view that we just made. And now what I'll do is a logical model based on that sample view. So I'll select add logical model. I'll call it my, or maybe a sample model. And it asks me which physical view do I want to use, right? So I have to select a particular physical view to use for the logical model, press finish. Obviously here I only have one choice, but you can see the rule here is that a given logical model always relies on a single physical view. So whereas a single physical view could be used in multiple logical models. So it's a kind of a many-to-one relationship. So I'll press finish, and that opens up this interface for me to specify the model that I want to show to users. And basically what I have on the left here is a list of all of the fields from the physical view, right? So this is what I can expose. This is what I have available to expose in the logical model, and then I choose how I want to show that to users. So the way you do this is you create entities. I right-click over here, select Add Entity, and maybe I'll call this entity something like Product Info. Right, Product Info, I've got an entity called Product Info, and in there I'm going to decide what I want to put. Right, what you can think of the entity kind of like a table, right? The entity is like the table, and then in there you put the attributes, which are like the columns of the table. But the important thing is that I have complete freedom to choose any fields that I want from any of the tables in the physical view, right? So it doesn't have to be, you know, a one-to-one mapping, right? So for product info, yeah, sure, I can take some information from the product table, like, you know, product name, that might make sense, and let's say description. Right, so I'm putting all these are going to be the attributes in that entity, but I could also take something from the categories table, like the category name, right? If I decide that that would, you know, for presenting this to users, by which I mean, let's say, dashboard developers and, you know, worksheet developers and report developers, I'm going to give them this data model. I want to construct some entities and attributes that make sense to them, right? So it might make sense to put the category name into that product info entity, even though it's from a different table. It doesn't matter. They don't need to know, you know, where it comes from in the database. This is, you know, what they're going to see. You know, and similarly into product info, I could also put something from, you know, something like, you know, order date or something like that. I don't know if that makes that much sense, but, you know, then basically in this product info entity, I'm also going to have, you know, a list of orders, you know, for when that product was ordered, right? That's probably not the best choice, just, you know, from a conceptual standpoint, but I just want to illustrate that you have freedom to, in any entity, you can put any field from the physical view, and then you can go ahead and create other entities. So let's say that, except that's not working for me. Where's my right click? There it is. Add entity, I can add another one, and let's say product info, let's say I can, you know, do customer info. Right, so now I've got another entity, and into there I could put stuff. So obviously customer info, one, you know, piece of information might be customer ID. And another piece of info might be the customer name, which is the company name. And then additionally, I might want to throw in the customer region, right? That's from a different table, this customer region alias table. Could throw that in there. Right, so again, you're basically constructing a view of the database schema, and you're tailoring it to your users. That's the whole idea of the data model, is that rather than, you know, the database, of course, the database schema has all the information, but it's usually in a very inaccessible format, right? A database schema is not designed for end users. It's designed, you know, principally for efficiency, right? That has a structure that's designed for efficiency so that the database can work really quickly to, you know, write and read data. But what you're doing here basically is you're taking the information from the database schema and you're putting it into a form that could actually be used by people who are not the database experts, right? User, dashboard developers, and so on. Right, so that's the whole idea. And then you go ahead and you save that. And then this is what gets exposed to users. So when somebody goes to develop a dashboard or to create a data worksheet, this is what they're going to see. So now if I, let's say if I go ahead, my computer seems to keep getting stuck. Okay, so if I were to go ahead and create a data worksheet here, new worksheet, right, then among the data sources that I would have at my disposal, here's the sample connection, all right, and now I know that there's a data model in there if I close that up, right, so there's the sample model that we just created. So somebody working on a data worksheet now would have access to this data model called sample model, and we know that it has two entities, product info entity and a customer info entity, and they could use any of these fields in their data worksheet. Similarly, somebody who wants to create a report, right? So a report developer also, right? So did I click that? Right. So somebody's creating a report in Style Studio, and they too would have access then to that data model. You know, so let's say they go ahead and create a chart in the report, and then under the data source listing, they've got under sample connection, they've got sample model, and again, they've got these two entities, this very small data model that they can build a chart or anything off anything else in a report off of. And the same is true for dashboard developers would also have access to that. So basically what I've shown you here, and I know I'm out of time, but I'll stay online to take questions. What I've shown you is just the basics of creating a connection to a data source. We saw that you can create a JDBC connection fairly easily. Whoops. All right, so we did this, where was it? Right, sample connection is our sample JDBC connection. I showed you that you can also do fairly simply a connection to an Excel or a text data source. That's this performance data connection. And for a JDBC connection and for an Excel connection, you can create a query. You just right-click, do a new query. So I showed you that. And then for a JDBC connection, I showed you can also create a data worksheet or create a data model. These are all different ways of getting at your data, but each one has its, its pluses and minuses. Creating a query, creating a data worksheet is, very quick and easy for targeted data. Creating a data model is more involved, but it gives you access to basically all of the data in the data set and so on, in the data source and so on. So I'll stop there. And if there's any questions, feel free to fire away by typing in the chat box or in the question box. And I'll just wait a minute because I know it takes time to type. Okay, I don't see anything popping up here. I'll give it another 20 seconds. Oh, something popped up. Okay, thanks very much, Hind. So I guess there's no questions. But thank you very much for joining and for joining all year. I really appreciate you guys giving the time. So I'll sign off and say happy holidays and happy New Year, and I hope to see you back next year. And there will be some email going out letting you know what the list of topics is, and I hope we can do this some more. So happy New Year, everyone, and take care.